So that's a decent segue into some of the more recent news because NIL has been a discussion for a while. We just haven't had a chance to talk about it. Josh, super conferences. It's, I was talking to Josh Pate the other day and he was talking about how the dead period, it seems like every year something falls like manna from heaven and just gives him content to talk about. And last year it was Oklahoma and Texas coming to the SEC. This year it's all this discussion about super conferences. And, universally, I think most college football fans are groaning about this because they see the writing on the wall and they see this becoming more of a NFL model and maybe paring down the teams that are in quote unquote D1 football. And again, I want to say a lot of people that are groaning about this have to realize that NIL, free transfers, the threat of college football playoff expansion created this monster. And I'm going to let you talk about why.
It comes back to what we were discussing when we talked about NIL in general. I mean, the simple answer here is that NIL, when we talk about NIL, we don't really mean name, image, likeness rights. What we mean is a world at which they can pay athletes for, basically for attending their school, and they call it NIL as a quote unquote legal reason to pay them. That means that if you are a big school, you can pull players that no one else can pull. And what it also means is you start to move closer to this idea of like a feeder system. The biggest name players now, they're going to have their own independent endorsement deals. They're going to be major celebrities. You can bring them on shows. They can be on the cover of, people realize, right? You can be on the cover in NCAA football and be an actual college athlete now. And those guys are all going to be concentrated in the major conferences. And the major conferences are going to be poaching the best players from other conferences that don't make as much money because they don't have as much TV exposure. And so you have this sort of building thing. And, there was a point that, Daniel and I have bounced around a lot, especially on Twitter. And I think this is maybe a good point to bring it up. I mean, when you talk about NIL and one of its effects, one of the biggest things it does is it breaks any semblance of regulation in the system for how you can keep competitive advantages from becoming too big. You have to remember, college football is entertainment. It has no entitlement to exist. It has no entitlement for people to enjoy watching it. And the only reason it's successful is people do enjoy watching the sport. So in that realm, you need some level of competitiveness for it to operate. And you need it to feel like your team is invested, but they have a chance to lose. And when you play a game, it matters. And so if you're a school like USC and you want to play games that matter and you want people to support you, USC needs to be in a conference that matters. And USC needs to be competing against teams that have an ability to beat them. And if you're another team in that big conference, you want to get in that boat too. And one of the things that I think actually scares the big conferences along this realm is because of the lack of control right now. It's possible for themselves to sort of run away from things to such an extent that, they can't really maintain the engagement they want to make. If they're so dominant that the game has become boring, it becomes a problem. If you want to draw the pro sports analog, okay, in pro sports, you have a draft, you have salary caps, and all these things are designed to make sure the league stays competitive. And in our NIL scheme that we have now, it's like if Robert Kraft at the New England Patriots could go down to Florida and they could say, all right, Brady, I don't have any salary cap to pay you an actual salary, but what I can do is give you an endorsement for my company, and that endorsement's going to be $100 million a year. So come to me, and I'll pay you $2 million a year in salary and $100 million in endorsements. Obviously, the NFL is not going to let that fly, but that is exactly what's happening in college football. So the biggest thing that's pushing these super conferences, it's not only TV money, but it's the desire for all the schools to be banded together to maintain competitiveness with the other schools that are good enough to be competitive so that they can stay relevant from a TV perspective. And I will tell you the next step of where it's going is that those conferences and schools want to have all the power in one place so they can self-regulate enough to keep things moderately competitive and interesting to keep the sport going.
And the thing I don't love about this, Josh, is look, I am not so naive to think that this college athletics and especially college football was just about, the purity of amateurism and the student athlete. Like, I get it. Like, that was not, we left that a long time ago, but there was this veneer of amateurism. And, when you hear people talk about the golden age of modern college football, it was the time leading up to the end of the BCS. And for all the complaints of like the NCAA, enforcing things back then and putting people on probation, like when the NCAA had teeth and there was no college football playoff, everybody loved college football a lot more than they do now. Everybody loved the postseason and the bowl games, and people weren't sitting out a lot more than they do now. And to me, as we move, and you think about it, it's not just the super conferences. I don't know if any of y'all been to a game in the last couple of years, but the NFLification of Saturday, the monetization of every step you make on campus, from pushing out paid parking all the way miles and miles off campus to, you can't just set up a tailgate anymore. You got to pay through the university if you want to get any square footage anywhere remotely interesting on campus, to the ridiculous facilities. Like, to me, it's moved so far away from amateurism, and the super conference thing is a acknowledgement of that and who suffers the most. Schools that in the future won't have these paycheck games to be able to field a team, which means at the end of the day, when we're left with like 60 D1 football teams, tens of thousands of young men who would have otherwise been going to college because they were good enough at football but not good enough academically are not going to get to go to college, because we are literally propping up the system to push everything towards the teams that were and the players that were already elite, that are already rich, and that were already going to go to NFL. And that's what concerns me the most is that this used to be an academic, athletic scholarship vessel, and now it's become the NFL.
Any sense of egalitarian benefit from the system is more or less gone. You have to realize the people that are going to make notable money from this in the major sports are the people that are probably going to the NFL anyway. And yeah, there are probably some examples. What the most recent would probably be like Dylan Moses at Alabama that tore up his knee. I forget if he went undrafted or 7th round, but he wasn't really anything like the player he thought he was going to be.
Jake Budd at Michigan.
Yeah, that's another one. Guys like that. Yeah, there's some examples of people who will help, but the people it's going to hurt the most are the people at the G5s. And there's probably going to be some programs that fold into this environment. I would have to think some programs at least step down to FCS if they don't fold entirely. And for those couple guys that you help that had a chance to be a millionaire and now they merely have a college education and the $2 million in insurance policy, you have hundreds of kids that aren't going to get a scholarship at all. And I don't know that that's a good trade-off. And there's one more thing I think we should touch on, or at least one more thing we should touch on before we move on. And that is, I think, the financial realities of the system and how that forced the moves. I don't blame USC and UCLA for leaving the Pac-12. I know there's a lot of anger from Pac-12 fans, but the reality for USC and UCLA is they were in a conference that wasn't willing to spend the money we're talking about spending to compete and was not able to do so. I mean,
and you're not even talking, Josh. You're not even talking about NNL, because you've been on this for a while, and I want to make clear to everybody who hasn't maybe followed us on Twitter, you're not just talking about backing up the Brinks truck and paying $50 million to steal a class. You're talking about just basic stuff.
Yeah, so this is a topic I've been on for a long time. There are a lot of those Pac-12 schools that don't have dedicated football facilities. They certainly don't all have indoor football facilities and all that kind of thing. And that starts to eat at recruiting. When they don't, you can go walk into most any Big Ten or SEC school, and you're going to find they have a dedicated weight room, a dedicated football facility, dedicated practice facilities. And you go to a Pac-12 school, and they got a crappy shared gym for the whole athletic department. It ain't going to fly. And so you end up losing out on recruits. And what's happened over time is one, NIL. I think they saw the writing on the wall that NIL was a whole other level of having to pay in that they weren't going to match, and because they aren't paying up, and I mean on a school by school basis, they are not investing in their programs the way they have. Fan interest is really died, and because fan interest has died across the board, the TV contracts and the revenue generated by these schools is garbage. And USC may have a lot of support, but their TV revenue, the TV revenue gap between them and the average Big Ten school was expected to be $50 million a year. And their athletic department budget is somewhere around, I think, $140 million. And to give you a concrete example of how messed up the priorities were, at least in my opinion, Stanford has a $7.5 billion budget, billion with a B, $7,500 million. They were going to run a $12 million deficit in the athletic department, so they cut 11 sports. And they certainly aren't investing in the football program with that kind of a monetary perspective. So you've got schools with, again, literally the kind of numbers we're talking here are orders of magnitude, right? 10 times the endowment, 10 times the budget of an SEC school, and they will not pay a fifth of what the SEC school does for these sort of athletic programs. And it's because of the academic focus of the administrators. It's because of their lack of knowledge of how this works. And it created such a bad environment that the only way a USC could compete is to generate more money. And the only way they can generate more money is going to a conference that's going to be interesting enough for people to actually watch their games because they care.
So, Josh, last thing on this, I'm just going to ask you what you think. Do you think USC spent all this money and did all this stuff for Lincoln Riley? And I imagine they had to spend a lot of NIL money to get the players they got with that package deal. Do you think they did all of that with a nod to already knowing that this stuff was going to happen? And this was kind of their precursor to sort of set them up to fold into the spending money sort of inertia that they needed to get into the super conference mode?
I think there's no way you can look at this situation and think that this wasn't already on their mind. I mean, as of February, this had to have been largely on the table. And, I do think, from like an NIL perspective, I think USC in particular, but also UCLA in that LA market, I think their attitudes and perspectives really changed because those schools realized in an NIL world where they are at the heart of media in the world, we can bring some money to the table to get recruits and to rebuild our program that no one else can. And for a while, those schools were absolutely wandering in the desert, and they didn't have much of an incentive to leave because they knew they weren't going to be competitive. And frankly, the Big Ten probably would not have taken UCLA, and they might not have taken USC 5 years ago. In this new NIL world, they bring so many more resources to that aspect of things that they realized they could compete, and they realized they were attractive enough. And I think that's when they go after Lincoln Riley because they see a path to being good again. And then they look at the Big Ten, and I think all this is tied together to them realizing there's a new reality where they. And I want to, maybe this is the last thing to note is there are several schools like that. I think USC's one. I think Tennessee is an obvious one. You got the owner of the Cleveland Browns. It's a huge supporter. He's a multi-billionaire. Miami has multi-billionaire boosters that are dumping money in the program. Several programs like this that are going to become players that have not been for several years.
Oklahoma State.
Yep, Oklahoma State potentially. I think you could maybe even a school like Nebraska, just because of how rabid their donor base is. They're going to move up, and at the same time, there's a lot of other schools. I mentioned Ole Miss because it's a particularly good example. Mississippi State and Ole Miss are good schools. They have very, very loyal fans. I'm not ragging the program, but from a money support perspective, the media market they're in, they can't really compete with like Tennessee and Miami, strangely enough. And so you're going to see some schools step way, way, way up, particularly like Tennessee is a historic powerhouse. Miami was a historic powerhouse at one point. USC was. They're going to step back up to the top. And then schools that have kind of risen up. TCU is another one. TCU is just doomed in this whole environment. A lot of other for every school that steps up to.
Sorry, Parker.
Yeah. For every school that steps up like that, you're going to see 2 or 3 fall down. I think it's a very important part that people haven't really talked about enough.